The story will begin.
Disjointed. He stood naked in front of the full-length mirror, flexing his biceps. The mirror flashed an amber warning, reminding him to stand still while it scanned his organs, blood, bones and skin. It would evaluate his health and adjust the multitude of enhancement implants scattered throughout his body, fine-tuning them as it went to maximise his physical and mental performance. This daily routine made him feel trapped and cornered, as if the mirror was a docking bay that he couldn't stay away from for more than 24 hours. He wanted to run into the sea or drink himself silly. He wanted to go off-grid and wander wherever he liked, and for as long as he liked. And the pressure to break free had been building for a while, to such an extent that he doubted whether he could make it through another day. As the timer in the top right-hand corner approached 0, he tightened his stomach muscles and straightened his back. The mirror snapped its daily photo for his archives and, he suspected, a central database. He clenched his fist and punched the mirror with all the force he could summon. 1,000 pieces flew across the room. The holistic guardian of his well-being was dismembered and lying scattered all around him. An enormous sense of relief welled up from deep inside. But what was that? The fragments of the mirror were continuing their work in isolation, and different parts of his body were choosing their own settings. His hands were getting warmer, his feet colder. His heart was racing. His stomach clenched and his calf muscles cramped. And yet, as soon as his brain registered a problem, it told him not to worry, immediately overriding all warnings. He screamed as the pain and euphoria of the dissection reached every part of his being.
Hello, I've got involved with this project at strange angles and very happy accidents. And one of the happier accidents is to get to meet this troublemaker here by the name of Tobias Revell, who wonderfully works and tries to not get too involved now because he's got so many other things on, with a design consultancy called Strange Telemetry, which seems to have acquired every mischief maker in the design field that I've ever tripped over. People like Justin Pickard and Georgina Voss, thank you very much indeed. So, you know, all the mad cats in the same sack, which is quite incredible. But he's first to come here along this evening. I'm not going to give too long an introduction, but come on. In the original sort of brief for this, there was a lot of talk about synthetic biology, which is something that you started in, but you've moved on to the uncanny.
Yeah. Oh, that's loud, isn't it?
very,
very loud.
I mean, these things don't follow each other like buses, but has the uncanny, have you been taken over by the uncanny?
Yeah. Mostly into...
It's always on the card.
I'm always on the card. I guess I'm going to talk about it, but I'm into strange stuff, and I think you're alluding to a lot of work I've done around where the spiritual and the magic creep into technology a bit, which I'm not really touching on so much here.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely more into the social and cultural readings of technology than necessarily like the technology itself, and the uncanny is a huge part of that.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you get on with it.
All right.
Thank you, Tobias.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Simon didn't mention I'm also here from London College of Communication, that you may have heard of. It's the sort of better looking, cooler cousin of CSM. I run a course over there called Interaction Design. I've got a couple of my students in the audience, which is nice to see. Hi, back. So Lois very kindly invited me here, and we had a quick chat, and I talked about this idea of my interest in the body as an interface, and I show this slide quite a lot at a lot of different talks. For those who don't know, it's Will Riker from The Next Generation stepping out into the holodeck on the Starship Enterprise, where he's got this sort of perfectly simulated world, and many storylines in Star Trek deal with the holodeck as an interesting paradox, which Catherine Hale's brilliantly surmised as, if you could perfectly and accurately simulate reality, why would you do anything else? Catherine Hale says, why does Star Trek exist? That people in Star Trek don't need to do Star Trek stuff. They could just stay on the holodeck and be perfectly happy. But in particular, what I'm interested in here is very often in the Star Trek, the stories that center on the holodeck dwell on the kind of permeability between the digital and the physical, and where the two things start to meet. So where either physical characters become too involved in the digital they're engaged in, or even the digital characters come out into the physical world of Star Trek sort of colonialism. And we're going to come full circle through this quick talk and in this idea of where that interface between the body and the simulation of the body is. So synthetic biology is a thing I've looked at quite a bit in the past. I'm going to show one of the projects I've done that sort of use that. But I realize I'm not interested so much in the technology itself so much as what it says about the way that we categorize and read nature. This is an image from a book by Dougal Dixon called Man After Man. He's got quite a few books of a similar caliber, and they're really interesting books because they're basically they're almost illustrated children's books as early speculative design that look at what might happen in the case of Man After Man, what might happen once we've evolved past our current form. He takes various futures into consideration. So in this future, it's sort of a new ice age and humans have evolved into this kind of yeti form. There's somewhere we're like antelope. There's loads of different ones. And I think for me, this is one of the problems, and the title also gives it away with this kind of, what's the future of the human? Because it's inevitably kind of perverse and macho. It's kind of really like, what's man next? We're going to get stronger and better and furrier and weirder, and it's going to be great. And it doesn't allow space for people whose bodies haven't yet been considered necessarily in the current debate, which is why I find it a bit problematic as me as a white man standing here telling you about bodies, because the world has been built for my body and by people with my body. But I think I do my best in my practice to really analyze and think about the other forms of being human that there are before thinking, how can I make the white man's body better? Especially this morning's troubling Guardian article about the toxic culture of like fitness programs and things, which was really interesting. So there's obviously people like Stella, who I actually love. I think he's really funny. He's a really interesting guy. When we think about the body as an interface, as a mechanical interface, as a machine interface, he's probably one of the first artistic practitioners that come to mind. He's constantly trying to plug things in or alter his body. He's been doing this project for about 3 or 4 decades now, which is about extending his arm, adding a new arm, things like that. I've seen it quite a lot, shared stages with him. He's really interesting. This is kind of at the good end of that. The other end of that is the kind of transhuman movement, which is really in this quest for immortality. But this is where my kind of interest in the body as an interface is. It's in the everyday experience. It's not in the weird artists who are doing strange things with their bodies and have the luxury and the privilege of time and resources to do that, but in the everyday failures and rubbings of the interface against our bodies. So this is a video from a couple of years ago now, actually. I don't think it was 2009. I don't think it's that old. But Hewlett-Packard released a laptop that had a webcam that would track faces on it, so it would follow your face as you moved around the room, but it didn't work for black faces. It just only picked up white faces. So the body it was interested in interfacing with was the white body. It wasn't interested in any other body. The video is titled HP Computers Are Racist. I don't think Hewlett-Packard are particularly racist. I'm sure they're not maliciously racist. I don't think so. But it talks about a culture that only considers the archetypal body as this white man's body, and it doesn't think about other bodies, and thus the interface becomes a point of failure for these bodies. So yeah, flashback a bit. A couple of years ago, I did a project. It was actually partly paid for by Leonardo, and we published a book with Leonardo for it as well, called Into Your Hands Are They Delivered. And I was interested in a thing called the naturalistic fallacy. Does anyone know what the naturalistic fallacy is? One person is nodding, but like trying to hide the fact that she's nodding, which is really interesting. So the naturalistic fallacy is this notion that there is nature and there is not nature. And those two categories never shall meet. Talking to the thing I was mentioning with Simon earlier, you can also add the supernatural to that. So there's the above nature, then there's humans, then there's nature. And this is a kind of category that was created as part of the sort of Christian tradition, where humans are put by God in charge of looking after nature. There's the Garden of Eden, it's your job to look after it, and the title into your hands that they delivered is borrowed from God's kind of statement to Adam and Eve when they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and he says, you've destroyed the harmony of nature, it's now your job to care for it. I'm no longer going to care for it. They are in your hands from now on. And the project was a speculation on, I got really into wasps for like 2 years, and I didn't talk about anything else but wasps for 2 years. But it was a speculation on a species of wasp that could reproduce in oil. So one of the interesting things about wasps is before genetic sequencing, people thought there were maybe like 10 or 15 different thousand species of wasps, because you could mostly only identify them by the shape of their wings. That's why they're called Hymenoptera, which means membrane-winged. And lots of things were considered to be flies and all sorts of things. And then with genetic sequencing, it was basically discovered with the help of the guys in the Natural History Museum that there are millions of species of wasps. And they evolve incredibly rapidly, and they will change shape and form simply based on whatever species they parasitize, because the vast majority of wasps that are non-social, so not the yellow rubber banded bastards, but the other ones, the vast majority, by 99.99999%, are solitary parasitic wasps. So they will target a species, and it's usually a beetle or a woodlouse or a caterpillar, and they'll plant their eggs in it, and then the eggs will eat the thing from the inside out, and then the wasp will burst forth. But depending on the thing they target, they'll change shape. And so when the only form of categorizing wasps was by looking at them, people thought these were all different things. They just thought they were different animals. No one thought that actually they're just rapidly morphogenic. So I speculated, what if this thing could perform abiogenesis and could breed from an inorganic substance, from oil? And what would that do for our kind of discussions about the way that we relate to nature? So this was presented as a series of sort of documents that were from a sort of scientific perspective, from research institutes that were basically saying everything we know about science is wrong because all our categories are incorrect. The border between nature and not nature has been collapsed, and it was an interesting project. But a bit like I said earlier, I wasn't so much interested in the biological element of it as how we as humans try and classify and see the world and try and name things and technologize and say that is that thing, it goes in that box, that is that thing, it goes in that box. And this kind of starts, in my recent research, I've sort of delved back into this. This actually starts with the atlases of the 18th century and before that even. So the attempt of scientists to classify the things they were observing as a result of colonialism, as a result of going around the world and discovering all these new species. This is a very early atlas, scientific atlas called the Hortus Cliffortianus. And what this created was a sense of science that was called truth to nature. So the idea was that your botanist or your naturalist would work with an artist, because botanists and naturalists aren't great artists, they are scientists who work with artists, and they aren't science. It took about 200 years, but we're there now. And they would draw these species, but the artist, of course, is trained to look for perfection, to look for the ideal, not to look for the reality. So they draw these species of plants that are perfected versions of what are observed. This plant never existed. This plant was never in the wild. It has been removed of imperfection by the artist's eyes. The artist has reproduced it. They've gone, well, that bit of mold's probably not meant to be there, and that leaf looks a bit out of place, so we'll get rid of that. And it creates, and then this is taken back to England or France, and it said, this is what all of this species is supposed to look like, all the others are imperfect. So this is a radical thing, right? This is saying that this is the true form of the plant that never existed and never can exist, because nature is imperfect. This is it, categorized, perfectly realized, perfectly drawn. This truth to nature objectivity is the mentality that gives us our structure of the world and makes us interface with the natural world. Stephen Connor, talking about a slightly different subject, but a sentence I constantly return to in Dream Machines, which is free and you can download it as a PDF. He says, there is no way of framing ethical, political, and philosophical questions, in other words, everything, that would not also have to be a matter of technique, or technesis, and so would not have to be imagined mechanically. In other words, what Stephen Connor's premise of Dream Machines is that as human beings, we can only think about the world mechanically. We can't do anything else. We're incapable of dealing with nature as it is. We can only reduce it into parts, into naming things, into classifications, into taxonomies, etc., etc., etc. So how does this then reflect on the body, which is what I want to kind of get into, and I'll just speed up a bit. Well, we start to classify bodies. We start to put bodies into categories. One of the first examples of this is really censuses, which evolved. This is the second UK census, the first was in 1801. But censuses evolved primarily as a way of a nation state keeping track of its fighting force. So the UK census of 1811, which is supposed to be an overview of the population of the UK, is actually only an overview of men between the ages of 18 and 50. Because that's the fighting force. They don't care about women or children. They're not interested. They're only interested in what their military strength is. So their interpretation of the ideal body is a man who can fight. We move on about 200 years, and we get to kind of the age of industrial production and the growth of anthropometry, which I can never pronounce properly, basically the geometry of humans. So with mass industrial production of furniture and technologies and things like that, there's loads and loads of studies done, mostly starting in the military-industrial complex, but also spanning into people like Henry Dreyfus, who worked for Herman Miller, of what are the ideal human proportions. These incredibly detailed studies of the body. What is the body? How far can it move? What directions? What's the height? What does it need to sit at? How long can it sit for? Etc., etc., which are used to create the most efficient machine for human activity. The Action Office 2 by Robert Props. There's a whole controversy about the Action Office 2 and 1, which I'm not going to go into, but I have got a 10,000 word essay about it, backed up if you want it. These studies by Henry Dreyfus directly contributed to the design of the cubicle and the office environment. Based on these measurements of the average human, who was a white man, obviously, the ideal space for this person to work is this, based on the angles they can turn, the amount they can sit, the position of their heads, etc., etc., etc. So we create a machine that interfaces perfectly with the human body in the form of the Action Office, which became the de facto model for the white-collar working environment. But it also becomes a space through which humans are processed as if they are just units in machine. They're no longer individuals. Again, think back to the plant that's been categorized and perfected. The ideal model of a person is driven through a machine. And with the advent of digital technology, this leads to a notion known as code spaces. Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge write about this quite a bit, as has Keller Easterling, which is this idea that when you move through certain spaces, airports particularly, you are actually just moving through a piece of software. The space itself is a physicalization of software. From the moment you enter the airport to when you're being watched, everyone you interact with in an airport has a 28-point checklist where when they're talking to you, when you go into an airport and someone says, "Where are you off to today?" That's actually part of the security checks. They have a 28-point checklist. They're watching out for if you're sweating, if you look pale, watching what you walk like, if you're turning your head behind. They ask you where you're going, and they want to measure how long it takes you to answer, etc., etc. Through to security, through to checking your bags, through to getting on the plane, through to being processed. This is you as a ticket, as a code, and I don't have the quote up annoyingly, but they write this brilliant thing is that the human body is erased except for a number, which is your ticket number. You're only known as a ticket number. Your body is not recognized, which is why, for instance, we have all these kind of interesting controversies about the fact that once full body scanning is introduced in about 2004, they fail to deal with sort of people who don't identify as either male or female gender, because the tickets don't allow for that kind of amount of nuance in the way that you're read by this massive piece of software that you're moving through. And then this security apparatus, if we're being very cynical, because most of Apple's software does come from their work with the military, comes into your body directly. It's put on your watch if you've got an Apple Watch, and it's telling you that you are not fulfilling our ideal body. You must close your rings, you must walk a certain amount, you must stand a certain amount, you must move a certain amount in order to be an effective interface for the data, for the software that you're moving through. So I'm always interested, I guess, in people who challenge these notions, who sort of put up an opposition in some way. This is a project from Zach Blass, who's a researcher down at Goldsmiths. He became very interested in an app that was released in around 2012, I think, which would allow you to judge someone's sexuality based on a facial scan. And this is primarily marketed at American Bible Belt parents as a way of figuring out if their 4-year-old child is gay before they know it, which is just appalling. So what Zach Glass did is he got the software, he tried his best to open it up as much as he could and figure out how it worked, and he decided to put all the settings to 100 and make the face. So in other words, this is the most gay face. which is brilliant, right? So you take all those, the average, I don't know how many this took, but a normal piece of facial recognition software looks for 32 key coordinates, corner of the eyes, tips of the nose, so on and so forth, and you just put, for the most gayish result, what do those have to be? And this is what those have to be. So he developed this, and he's been working with various things around facial recognition technology and how those things are made to make, how measuring the body digitally is used to make judgments about the values that someone has. And I guess this is where we get onto the holodeck stuff. We're starting to see, of course, now that we have enough measurements of the body from anthropometry into facial recognition software, we start to see the body being rendered as an ideal. This is Michaela Sousa. For those who don't know, she's an Instagram model who isn't a physical being. She is a purely digital being. She only exists as a body through Instagram. What's very interesting about her, and my colleague Natalie Kane has made this point really well, is that of course we've had a long history of female bodies being represented digitally, you know, from Lara Croft on to kind of digital pornography. But this is the first time that's ever been aimed at women. This is the first time, well, not the first time, but one of the biggest times that a digital female body has been marketed to be an ideal for women, not for men, which has profound implications. And you know, one of the there's another very famous Instagram CGI model who's black, and one of the points that's been made is they're erasing the actual work of black women and the potential for black women to actually become bodies that are desirable because they're only ever being represented in CGI in this form. So what happens when, I had a massive James C. Scott quote, but I'm not going to use it. So what happens when the reading of the body becomes so accurate that we can simulate the body, that the body can actually be remade and made better? Think back to the truth to nature thing, right? The artists and naturalists who were dissatisfied with nature rendered a better version of nature to take home. What happens if our modeling of the body is so accurate we can render a better model of the body to take home? So this is a project I did earlier this year for Clerkenwell Design Week called Synthesizing Obama. I think it's 64 acrylic sheets with Python code engraved on it, but basically it's the code to completely and accurately replicate Barack Obama. So this is a paper done by 3 people with eminently pronounceable surnames who they basically took a load of video footage of Barack Obama doing talks, they trained a machine learning system, and then they recreated a 3D model of Obama such that you could put in any vocal track, any piece of text to speech, and it would accurately replay his facial movements and body and be convincing. Interestingly, again, this is a technology that's directly borrowed from pornography. So deep fakes is a thing in pornography where you can replace the head of a pornographic actor with a celebrity's head. That's also something that was then sold to Snapchat. All came out of Washington University, though. So basically, this was a way of basically saying, if in the future, because this was engraved on plastics, it's going into a time capsule for 40,000 years, anybody ever wanted to replay Barack Obama, they could do it. They could get that code and replay him. And so there's artists as well who are starting to play with what if we can, you know, instead of just realizing the body imperfection as per the Instagram models and the attempts to fake Obama, what if we could take the potential of the body into the digital? A bit like the transhumanists and the kind of Stella work, we are trying to reveal the potential of the body physical. What if we could reveal the potential of the body digital? Again, I've only got a short time. There's dozens of artists doing this kind of work. Simone Nickel is an artist I commissioned for a festival last year to do a project called The Fragility of Life, where she discovered that in video games, a lot of the, you know when you get character creation in video games and you can kind of set the height and stuff, a lot of that is borrowed from a US Air Force data set from the 70s, where when Lockheed Martin were commissioned to design some planes, they wanted a load of anthropometric measurements of the average US pilot, which were then fed, and then this data set was opened up and became the driving force. So she, a bit like Zach Glass, decided to play with the extremes of this. What if we went crazy? What kind of bodies could we have? You think of Legacy Russell's work in Glitch Feminism, where she talks about the fact that we shouldn't divide our physical and digital selves. They're the same. The fantasies we have about the digital are a part of ourselves. We shouldn't separate them and push them apart. And then finally, I suppose, just to go back to the holodeck a bit, you know, what happens once we get very good at simulating bodies, which we are now very good at. We can do it completely accurately and very believably. We're getting very good at synthesizing nature as well, taking that idealized version of nature in the natural world and dreaming it into a completely immersive environment. Rob Wetzer, who's a fantastic Dutch photographer, does landscape photographs in video games. So he goes around video games and does these beautiful sort of vistas and landscapes and captures them, and some of them don't look so believable, but some of them just look really believable. But then you realize they're only believable because they play to some ideal you have about nature. Nature is messy and ugly and full of crisp packets, and it rains all the time. But in this case, they become this ideal, this kind of beautiful version of nature that we perhaps lost and many of the Renaissance painters aspired to. So that's my talk. The body is an interface, the body as something that is read and then re-represented in the world. The biological aspects of that are interesting, and they're kind of ongoing, and I think, you know, technologies like synthetic biology and transhumanism will continue to have their impact. But I think what's really important to bear in mind is the everyday times that your body is read, going through a gate, being recognized by a facial recognition camera, you know, not being able to access something because you look too young or too old. Thank you very much, guys.